here at Monash Education. And I welcome you from everywhere around tonight. We can see already on the YouTube chats that there's people joining us from not only Melbourne, but right around Australia and globally as well. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this event. And it's amazing in the 2 or 3 years that these STEMinar events have been running to see the community build and really to see people really enjoying these events and joining in as well. Okay, thanks, Joe, for the next slide. So before we start our event tonight, I'd just like to acknowledge the lands on which we all meet today and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to specifically acknowledge that the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University now stands. We pay our respects through our research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung elders and their past, present and future communities. So tonight's event is going to be in 2 parts. First of all, we are going to have a presentation from Professor Deborah Corrigan from our Monash Education Futures team. So she's going to be presenting her excellent report about implementing an integrated STEM education in schools. And she's addressing 5 key questions here. A very comprehensive report. And if you haven't already read it, then after tonight would be a great chance to read through it. And it's a really great report that is really readable for teachers, leaders of schools and academics alike. Finally, after that, we'll have a Q&A panel where we'll have a few panelists join us and we'll fire some questions at them and then we'll invite some audience questions. So throughout the night, if you have any questions come to mind, please feel free to add those to the YouTube chat comments. And some of our team will make sure that we take note of those and have them ready for later on if possible. Now, we'd love you to join in on the conversation. As I just mentioned, the YouTube comments is a great spot to mingle and chat with other like-minded people who are also on this event. But we'd also love for you to share on Twitter if you're a Twitter user. You can see that we have 2 accounts that would like for you to tag in these ones. So at Monash Education and at Monash Ed Futures. And then also just use the Monash STEM hashtag. That will create a bit of a thread from this event and previous events as well. And finally, we will be having a poll everywhere in the middle part of this event where we're going to be asking you a multiple choice question because we really value that audience input, and that input will help us to guide future research and future events as well. So for those of you who joined us for our last seminar, we did use Poll Everywhere, a word cloud here. And as you can see, we asked this question here, the one word that you want associated to your STEM program. And it was amazing to see the responses here where we had over 200 people contribute and the words that really came out from us. And it became really useful for us to see these and understand what it is that people want in their STEM programs. And I know for a fact that Deb, who's presenting tonight, really valued these responses and we'll be actually touching on this word cloud again later this evening. Okay, thanks, Jared. I will bring you our STEM education website. So on that website, we have a range of professional learning resources from videos to our Let's Talk STEM web series. We've also got a range of our STEM talks there, as well as ways that you can interact and engage with our Monash community in terms of your professional development for STEM education. So I highly recommend you take some time and go to that website if you haven't already. We also have like to continue to develop their, who would like to develop their professional knowledge in STEM education. From all the people that I've heard, from what I've heard, people are really engaged in that course and have found it very useful for their own professional development. So I really do encourage you to engage in that course. Okay, thank you, Jared. Next slide. And next one again, thank you. So I apologise, I think I've got some bad connection here in my house today. Okay, I'd now like to introduce you to Professor Deb Corrigan, who is the Director of the Monash Education Futures team. So Monash Education Futures is a collaborative platform where educators, researchers, policymakers, industry and community leaders can come together to imagine the future of education through research, debate, collaboration and innovation. The purpose of this think tank is to translate research findings into real-world outcomes that will make a difference to the life of every learner. So as I said, Deb will be presenting on her report, and having read this report is a great comprehensive report that gives a really good snapshot of of the state of STEM education at the moment. So welcome, Deb, and I'll throw it over to you.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks very much. So hopefully I won't have too many bugs in the internet system. So Jared, if you could switch the slide. Sorry, yes, okay. So just a little bit about Education Futures. So the Spotlight report is actually going to be hosted on the Education Futures website, and I'm just presenting some very high level findings from the report. But Education Futures is designed to focus on the learner. So we know that learning occurs at every stage of life. And we know that if we're going to make some real changes in and imagine new possibilities for education, that not only is it a focus on the learner, but it's about collaboration with people like myself, the Faculty of Education, other researchers, external stakeholders, and a diversity of social sectors. So we need to get all of this expertise together if we're actually going to make some changes or imagine some new possibilities for education policy and practice going further. And I think importantly also, and part of the reason why the Spotlight report then becomes useful, is that we want to take the academic research, our own as well as other people's research, and present it in ways that it can actually have some educational impact for practitioners and the profession generally. So that's what the Spotlight report is about. So if I can have the next slide. And here it is. So if you go on the Education Futures website, you can download the Spotlight report. I warn you, it's 17 pages, but you can just look at bits and pieces of it. But the focus that I took so that it is useful to the profession is that I took the 5 questions that I always get asked about STEM education. And you see those 5 questions there. So the report is designed to answer those questions using the research that we know from around the world, as well as our own. Next slide, please, Jared. And so in answering the very first question, what is STEM education? I think it's really important here to make a distinction between STEM and STEM education. So STEM is often quoted in the papers. It's often quoted by people like the chief scientist and other policymakers. And it's often quoted as though it's the same as STEM education when it's in fact very different. So STEM is the practice of the professional from the disciplinary fields of science, technology, engineering and maths. And the way they talk about it is about in terms of the skill set and the capabilities they have rather than the content. So they talk about things like problem solving or collaboration or communication. STEM education though is specifically for the purposes of learning. And I'm using the definition from the report that STEM education is the integration of science, technology, engineering and maths to explore real world problems. And I think the really important bits there is that it is integration of those disciplines for exploring real world problems. Next slide, please. So I returned to the word cloud that came from the last STEMinar. And I think this is also really spot on. So it was very encouraging to see all of the responses from the people from the last STEMinar. What you notice about those words is that there's hardly any content words there. They're all doing words. And so what I think is really important is then when we're talking about the integration of these disciplines, we're actually talking about not only what we know, but what we can do with that knowledge. So can we engage? Can we collaborate? Are our knowledge usable in very authentic settings? You know, can we identify problems? They're the really interesting things that we need to talk about, and actually the doing and the active part of it rather than the content. And that's obvious in this word cloud. So that was very encouraging to see. But I think, next slide, please, Jared. But I think in answer to the second question, why is STEM education important? I know it's commonly referred to as we need it because it's going to be, you know, the future workforce. But that's important for STEM. Why is STEM education important is a very different question. And I'm borrowing from Roger Bybee here, who talks about we need everybody, and that is absolutely everybody, to be STEM literate. What does that mean? We need to develop the knowledge, attitudes and skills to identify real world problems. Not all problems in the world are actually suitable for exploring through a STEM lens. So we need to also be able to identify them. We also need to be able to understand and seek the new knowledge. So in order to do that, we have to understand the characteristics of the STEM subjects. So science is a way of thinking and acting, technology is a way of thinking and acting. We need to develop an awareness of those different traditions of thinking and acting in order to explain the natural and designed world with this knowledge. So we've got to seek the new knowledge and we've got to apply that new knowledge if we're going to solve these problems. And I think it's also about to gain a willingness to engage and reflect upon STEM-related issues as a global citizen. And I think the current COVID-19 is a perfect example of how we need to do that. So we have conversations like, you know, when is a vaccine possible? Or it's a vaccine or a therapy. Which way should we be investing our money? Which way is more credible? You know, there's a big race for a vaccine. Which one's more credible in that? So there are some really important decisions that we need to, based on our STEM knowledge, if we're going to move forward. So that's about being STEM literate, and that is something that everybody needs to do. Next slide, please. Okay. Another reason why it's important is that, and I take the work of Leonie Rennie here, who is a well-known Australian science educator. She talks about the power of STEM education can be evaluated by developing what she calls a worldly perspective. And she says there's two dimensions to this worldly perspective. And we need to get the balance between this right. The balance between, in the first perspective, between disciplinary knowledge of science, technology, engineering and maths, and the integrated knowledge that's required in STEM. And you need to balance them because there's a certain amount of power that comes from knowledge. And so if they're out of sync, so currently many people would think that they are unbalanced and that the emphasis on single disciplines outweighs the usefulness of what you can do with integrated STEM. So we need to get that balance right, and that becomes very powerful knowledge. The other balance that we need is between local knowledge and global knowledge. Again, there's a power differential there. So when it's out of balance, we privilege one context over the other, or one type of knowledge over the other. When I'm in schools, I often see many people be very ambitious about a STEM project that they might do. It might be something like climate change. Now, climate change is really complicated and it's a very big global issue. But another more useful local issue to start with might be, in actual fact, climate trends in the local area. And so, which also has particular power. So what you can apply in your local community and your everyday experiences becomes fundamentally important if you're actually going to then start to engage on a global issue. And so getting that balance is also right in those two perspectives, and the power that you can gain from having those two things in balance, a really solid knowledge of the local so that it can be applied in the global. Next slide, please. So in moving to the third question, some oversights as to how we can include STEM education in school education. I've taken 3 levels just to sort of highlight, this isn't everything that is in the report, but just to highlight some of the major points. So at the policy level, I think it's really important for its own sake. I'm not saying that maths and technology and the disciplines aren't important, but I am saying that we also need STEM education for its own value, and its value is in the connections that it makes between the disciplines, capabilities such as creativity, critical thinking, ethical practice, and priorities such as Indigenous cultures, our sustainability. So it's those connections that we actually make between all of those things that are important and valued in general education that actually gives STEM education its intrinsic educational value all of its own. Some things to consider though at the school level. There are some very clear things that the research points out. Individuals, in schools, this will be students in particular, do not use knowledge learnt in school in everyday life. And the reverse is also true. They do not use their everyday life knowledge in school. It's like where learners do not transfer learning across school subjects. And that's particularly more evident in secondary schools than primary schools. And that's known as the transfer paradox. But it still exists. In order to deal with these transfer, like STEM education, can begin across school subjects, and also the transfer between school and real world. So there's some things that we really need to pay attention to. From learning, we also know that both education and cognitive education understood for a long time the importance of interest and motivation to learning. And that's based on the fact that learning is constructive and not a receptive process. Learners have to construct things in their own understanding for themselves and not be told. I'm sure as parents we can all resonate with that quite nicely. Motivation and beliefs are integral to cognition. And again, I think probably the current situation in Melbourne, where schools, or in Victoria, where children aren't at schools, has highlighted the importance of both the cognitive and the social. So we need to bring those two together. Well-being and learning, cognition, need to actually come together and be integrated. And again, social interaction is the fundamental to cognitive development. And some of the work that I'm currently doing with some colleagues in Education Futures is actually looking at social network mapping in conjunction with cognitive mapping to see how those two influence each other at the same time, rather than deal with academic progress and well-being separately. And the other thing we know from cognitive scientists is, so the context in which you're operating is fundamentally important and must be recognised. And while our scope to contextualise it, it sometimes is so full that we forget to do that. But that is fundamentally important, because if you don't know the knowledge and the strategies and develop the expertise in a range of contexts, you have a lesser ability to apply that knowledge in different contexts and across contexts. So next slide, please, Joan. Okay. So different pedagogical approaches to STEM education can be employed. And I've got 4 here that are quite common. Well, some are more common than others, but they're in increasing complexity. So at the very simplest level, we've got disciplinary pedagogy. So this is where students learn concepts and skills separately. So what you learn in science, what you learn in maths, technology, are all dealt with separately. The next sophistication level is multidisciplinary pedagogy, and we see this in schools already, where students learn concepts and skills separately in each discipline, but with a reference to a common theme. So it might be, in primary schools, a common theme is me, for example. And so that's an example of multidisciplinary pedagogy. In interdisciplinary pedagogy, increasing the sophistication again, students learn concepts and skills from 2 or more disciplines that are tightly linked. You often see things like this in project-based learning. And so it could be something like a school garden. And so they might be learning things from technology and how to build a garden. They might be looking at science and what to plant, climate, all of those sorts of things. So that would be interdisciplinary. And while we see some of that, it's less transdisciplinary pedagogy. And this is where students undertake real-world problems. So it's the real-world problem or the project that is driving the exploration or the investigation, and allows students to shape their own learning by applying knowledge and skills from 2 or more of the disciplines. It's quite difficult, but it's well worth the risk. And I suppose I'm presenting it here because this is one of the areas where I think teachers really need some support from leadership to sort of say, take a risk, learn from your mistakes, but it's really worth engaging in. Next slide, please, Jared. So, Jared, can we move the next slide? Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think this is a really useful... okay, so the slide previously was just an example using systems thinking. And so this one, so what you see in the buff colour is, so if you're thinking about a system, if you're communicating effectively, what are you actually doing? And I think this is a really interesting planning tool. So, if you're communicating effectively and you're thinking about systems and systems thinking tool, you're describing the systems accurately and concisely, and you're using a variety of graphic tools. If you're focusing on the inquiry and investigation while working in teams, what is it that you're doing? You're looking at how elements change over time, you're focusing on patterns and trends, and you're working in teams on problem solving, and so on. So I think it's really useful to sort of say, when you're planning these sorts of STEM learning experiences, to sort of say, so what is the purpose and what will we be doing to realise that purpose? And that was just an example from the US that I thought might be helpful. Next slide, please. So the fourth question, and I think this is really, I think this should give some credence to why STEM education is important, is what is the impact of STEM education likely to have on students? So the impact here should not be confined to academic achievements. It's also got to consider the social and environmental context in which knowledge is gained and where that knowledge is gained from. So it's not just teachers, it's peers, it's family members, it's community members, it's a whole range of people. So we do know from the research that if students engage in STEM education in a type of integrated curriculum, students who do experience that outperform those who are in more traditional classes based on any form of academic assessment. We also know that STEM education improves student achievement, interest, motivation, and self-efficacy, their belief that they can actually do this stuff. We also know that it improves problem-solving skills and promotes the use and retention of higher order thinking skills. Now, these are really important because I think higher order thinking skills are the things that really help differentiate what humans are capable of as opposed to what artificial intelligence is capable of. Higher order thinking skills are those things that require nuanced judgment, they're non-algorithmic, non-routine. And so these become fundamentally important to enable students to engage with them. And so STEM education has the opportunity to actually not only get students to use them, but retain them. And it also has an improved ability to share, for students to share learning outcomes, share their ability to work with others and their attitudes and value for group work. So next slide, please. Next slide, yes. Okay, and so then the last question really is, what will be the indicators of success for STEM education? And so from a student perspective, I'm actually using Kit's quote here, because I think it's nice to picture, you know, what students, if they've been in STEM education, what would they have been experiencing? So Kit says, having engaged in open-ended problem-solving activities, it leads to greater confidence in real-life problem-solving, improved teamwork and communication skills. And that's the immediate indicators. In the longer term, students will have further developed higher order thinking skills, enabling that transfer of learning between subject areas, and hopefully this might be unconscious. It might be a seamless switching between what they've learned in the different subject areas, and hopefully develop what Pitt's called a metacognitive super skill of choosing which mode to think in as a designer, an engineer, a scientist, or a mathematician. Next slide, please. But there are also indicators of success of STEM education from teachers. And so not only is it through teacher professionalism, through things like increased self-efficacy and their belief that they can engage and do this, changes in their practice, their improved understanding of an integrated content of STEM, as well as their increased pedagogical content knowledge in their field of expertise in one of those disciplines. It also, though, has impact on quality practice, teachers working cooperatively, working together, building relationships, and removing those artificial barriers and developing new programs, creative use of their skills, and developing positive team teaching experiences. These are all recognised indicators of success from engaging in STEM education. Next slide, please. And so just to finish up, I just wanted to highlight, now the school on the left is quite a famous school. It's the Green School from Bali. And if you don't know much about it, I think you probably should go and have a look at it. There's quite some nice photos and things online. But it's actually been built from sustainable materials that are locally sourced. Open classrooms, classroom structure does not seem to be as apparent as it would be in an Australian school. Mixed groups, and so it's really driven by the issues or projects or problems that the students identify. And so I suppose it's a really nice way to finish, because I think one of the things that we need to think about is STEM education does have much to offer, but it does rely on the instructional design and the support for educators in that endeavour. But it's also very importantly about adjustments to the learning conditions. We do need to provide learning environments that are actually going to enable the learning conditions that we want. And so to finish up, what has become clear also is that the traditional notions of classrooms, with their emphasis on teacher-centred approaches, do need significant rethinking, and learning environments for the future do need to be seriously reimagined. And I just point you to my colleagues, Jo Deppler and Kathleen Akins, who wrote the Flight series report around responsible innovation, designing schools for tomorrow learners. So just for your interest while you're there. So thank you very much for your attention tonight.
Okay, thank you very much, Deb, for your presentation there. We understand that there are some connection issues going on, so please bear with us. We're all in stage 4 restrictions here in Melbourne, so all from our own home and relying on home internet to get this event to you tonight. So apologies for those connection issues, but hopefully you picked up on some of the amazing stuff that Deb presented there in her presentation about this report. We are now going to get some audience participation in this event, and we're going to use a multiple choice question here. So Jared, if I can get you to pop up the next slide there, we're going to utilise Poll Everywhere for this question. So if you have a device on hand, or if you can open up another window, please. The link will be put into the YouTube comments, or if you can't see that, you can see a link at the top there of that slide. And the question we want you to answer is that in your teaching and learning context, what do you see as the main barrier to effective STEM integration? Now, Deb mentioned in her presentation that there were 3 key areas here for the barriers, I guess, in integrating STEM education. One of those was the policy level. The next one was at the school level. And then finally, it was at the learning level, or the teacher level as well. So if you can just pop on to that Poll Everywhere now, and we'd love to see what you think in terms of your barriers to effective STEM integration. Now, Deb, while we've still got you there, I think we can't see Deb on screen, but she is here with us. While people are responding to that, why did you choose these 3 specific areas, do you think?
Well, I think they're all important, and they all interact, obviously. So I think probably I see a lot of things happening at the policy area that we could improve, and so it's important that researchers and leaders, education leaders, actually have some input into that. But I also think that there's a whole lot of things that the schools and teachers could do to support each other. And so while there is good work going on, and I acknowledge that, I do think that these 3 really need to work together. And by sort of highlighting 3 levels, we can sort of look at the barriers and say, so where is the biggest effort needed here? And I think that's really important. And what sort of effort is needed? So it's sort of designed to move forward, to remove those barriers as much as possible.
Absolutely, and I can see by our poll at the moment that it seems to be the school level and the curriculum within the school that seems to be the biggest barrier for most people who are contributing. Now, even though you can only contribute via a sort of an ABC multiple choice here, we do encourage you to communicate why you think these are barriers in those YouTube comments, and keep that conversation flowing there. There's some of our Monash team on there that will help to that will assist in getting that conversation continuing throughout those chat. I will just give another minute or so for you to contribute to this poll, and we'd love to use this, see this data come up, so we have a better understanding of what you think those barriers are. So thank you, Deb. While we're waiting for that, thank you for your presentation. It's fantastic to hear, and I know that from speaking to you, you read about 200 papers or articles to put this paper together. Is that right?
Yes, more than that. So yes, and it's tried to be quite global in its orientation, and so hopefully that gives practitioners an access to quite a diverse research base. Because if you do look at it, a lot of it is dominated by the US, and it's a very different scenario, given that they've got engineering a bit more explicitly in their curriculum than we do.
And with the 5 questions that you addressed tonight, did you go into this research with those questions in mind, or did they come out of the research as you were going through?
No, they're the questions that people always ask me. So, and I think it's also really important that if I was in a school, I also think they're probably the questions that I would need to ask if I'm going to convince people that STEM education is important. So, so I think they're actually really important. They would have arisen out of the literature as well, but I think importantly, I wanted the focus of, so why is this important and why should we do it? I think is a really important thing, and how can the research support the practitioners in thinking about that?
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think it's now time to, thank you for your contribution to this poll here. It's now time to introduce our panel to start the Q&A part of the evening. So if I can get Jared across to the panel slide, and we'll see our panelists start to appear in screen here. So first of all, we have 4 people on our Q&A panel tonight. We have Deb, who we've just heard from now. We also have Dr. Jared Carpendale, who is a lecturer in STEM education in the faculty at Monash Education. Jared also has vast experience as a secondary physics and chemistry teacher. Is that right, Jared? And he has joined our faculty in the last couple of years from New Zealand. So we won't hold that against him, but welcome, Jared. We also have Josephine Blackley, who is the principal at Christ the King Primary School in Geelong. Jose has vast experience in school leadership, as well as working for at a system level with Catholic Education Melbourne. So welcome, Jose. And lastly, we have Natasha Ward, who is an education officer at EcoLink in Bacchus Marsh, which is a science and technology innovation centre. So, and Tash is also actually a Monash alumni, recent Monash alumni, and finished her initial teacher education with us in the last year or 2, I think that is. So welcome to our panellists. I'm going to be throwing some questions across to them this evening. And then, as I mentioned, while we go through this, please put your questions into the YouTube comments, because later on we'll have Chantal and Grace putting some of your questions to our panel members as well. So I'm going to put the first question to Jose. So Jose, have we got you on there? I can't see, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, excellent. So Jose, the report mentions that leadership which supports planning, instruction and assessment strategies is vital for the success of all these initiatives, and sends a message about what is considered important and what is valued by school administration. So from your own context and experience, can you please share some examples of what leadership support for STEM education might actually look like in practice?
Thanks, Lucas, and thanks very much, Deb, for the presentation tonight. I must say I enjoyed reading your paper. It's good to be able to think at that level again. But in terms of my experience at Christ the King in Newcombe, Geelong, we first were catapulted into STEM education through our involvement in first Lego League competitions. We began that in 2016 and have done so each year, and we've won awards regionally, state, national awards, and also international awards. And for me, as the principal who was involved with the Lego League coach in this, I found it was an excellent opportunity for me as the leader to learn really what's involved in STEM education, because the first Lego League competition certainly requires the students to do a lot of research to identify what sits behind the problem before they can even come up with a solution. And this means they've got to reach out to industry experts and to sort of understand what the problem is to design solutions. And the complexity of the problems that are posed naturally integrate science, technology and engineering and maths across the board. So when the students are designing a solution, all those things are working simultaneously together. And this means that the students in actual fact are developing skills far beyond what are for year 5 and 6 students in, curriculum content of science, technology. Well, we don't have engineering as such, but we do have design technology and maths. And the other thing that was great about it with this competition was that the core values that the students had to demonstrate in the competition fully aligned with the capabilities in the Victorian curriculum. However, whilst we were successful in these competitions, I was really conscious that we're only building the capacity of a select group of students, because we had 8 in a team each year and was 1 teacher and myself to a certain extent. So in 2018, we decided to take a different approach with STEM education so that all students in the school and all teachers in the school could actually build their knowledge and understanding around STEM education. So one of the first things we did was develop a STEM committee And on that committee, we had a prep teacher, one from the Year 1-2 learning community, a teacher from the 3-4, one from the 5-6, plus our learning and teaching leader, who was the first Lego league coach. And those teachers were released every fortnight to plan and discuss how we would move forward in this space of STEM education. So one of the other things we did is we had looked at existing documents, curriculum documents, in particular scope and sequence, and we thought the best way to perhaps approach this initially was to look at inquiry learning, our scope and sequence for inquiry learning, because that has components of students taking action, and we were wanting to make this more problem-based for the students. So we set about integrating a STEM focus with every inquiry unit, and then from that the students were identifying problems, sometimes real world, but sometimes, as you said, Deb, in the actual local community. So that then led to the development of a STEM planning document. So then the teachers sort of helps them feel a bit comfortable if they know that the curriculum is being addressed. So the planner reflected the problem the students would be addressing, the curriculum that was being addressed, as well as the concepts, thinking skills and capabilities that were being developed. And within that there was science, technology, engineering, maths links, and the curriculum links were being monitored and continually monitored throughout the unit. The other thing that we felt that we needed to do, this was more for our students, but also our teachers, was actually be explicit about a design thinking process. So we felt that students need to be scaffolded to find solutions to problems. So we explicitly taught that. That's all within, from prep to 6, the vocab around the design thinking process is shared and understood across the school and used when engaging with a STEM focus. The other important thing that we did along the way was we developed strong partnerships with industry experts and also universities. And this was integral to supporting both the students and the teachers in building their knowledge for a start and their skills, but also connecting the problem to something that was real world. And it also, I think, supported them to become better problem solvers. Like with any good leadership, you're always building capacity of staff. So the STEM committee was instrumental in teachers leading teachers. So they ran some of the professional learning with staff. And this was again around the design thinking process. And this was leading them through the process to design problems that teachers faced in the school, and actually just living out that process. And that was really highly successful and really got things moving for us as a school, because it wasn't me leading it as such. It was like the teachers, the team leading the teachers. We also involved other teachers working with Monash University, Lucas in particular, with an action research project. So this was about building their capacity. Another year in, we felt that whilst we built the capacity of our STEM committee, we needed to turn our attention to more the late adopters. And so we focused in 2019 very much providing external professional learning for teachers in the area of STEM education and digital technologies. And alongside this, we're also doing a lot of our own work around understanding the curriculum of digital technologies. So we have a coaching program in our school. We have for the last 4 or 5 years. We have 5 coaches who coach teachers, and 2 of the STEM committee members are coaches. So they've been also working with our staff on identifying their goals and working through that process with them. This also becomes part of a professional learning plan that they write up and discuss with me as part of the annual review process. Another important thing that we've done as a school is to develop a pedagogy statement around STEM education. And this is about having a shared understanding around how we approach STEM education at school. The document will continue to evolve, but it's a starting point. And it's very useful when you're employing new staff and also inducting those new staff so that they understand, you know, this is how we approach, this is what we value. In our master plan, we also built in a maker space for our year 3s to 6 students. It's well resourced with both digital and design technologies. And our prep to 2s also have a space for that as well. The final thing I'd probably say is that we've also given our, probably more so our STEM committee, lots of opportunities to be out there, presenting at conferences and also entering other STEM related competitions. And what I find about this is that that gives them the opportunity to learn from other people in the community and also to bring that knowledge back to our community. So I'm probably not telling people anything they don't know about leading. It's about time, resource support, but I also think it's about passion and conviction. And I don't think, if I had not have been directly involved in those first Lego League competitions a couple of years ago and having travelled to Hungary to the international competition and so forth, I wouldn't have fully understood the impact this can have on our students. So that's probably all I've got to say. I hope that's helped.
Thanks very much for that, Jose. And what the key message I think there is that idea that it takes time. You've really put a long-term commitment into building up your teacher capacity and ideas. And I've, as you mentioned, been lucky enough to see your school in action with this. Ideas of having a STEM committee across the whole school has really enabled teachers to feel part of it, and it really helps to bring in, you know, it's not just a senior school thing, it actually is something that happens right across the school, which is a very interesting way to look at it. So thank you for your response there, Jose, and we'll come back to you shortly. My next question is going to go to Jared. So Jared, in your experience as a secondary science teacher, during Deb's presentation and in her report, she really hones in on that need to develop these skills. And in your experience as a secondary science teacher, do you think enough time is dedicated to building skills such as critical thinking, creativity, and problem solving in the day-to-day teaching?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lucas. And good evening to my colleagues here on the panel and to our colleagues out on YouTube as well. And I'd love for people to put their comments about that question into the YouTube comments section as well, about how you saw creative and critical thinking and problem solving in secondary school and what that might have looked like for you as a teacher or as a learner. Because it's certainly from my experience, and I think it ties nicely to what Jose was just saying about that leadership, and I could see strong links between what she was saying and those barriers that Deb was talking about. And I found it particularly interesting, the shape of the graph that came out from our poll everywhere a few slides back, particularly around the school level. And that, you know, 70% of our participants tonight were reporting that's where they found that barrier level. And I thought that was quite interesting, because I think for creative and critical thinking and problem solving in secondary schools, I certainly think that it depends on the school culture and on the school values. And I also think, though, that it goes to the individual teacher. So when I've gone out to visit schools here in Melbourne and in New Zealand as well, I often see a bit of a difference, particularly in the junior secondary school and the senior secondary school, in terms of that creative and critical thinking and that problem solving. And a lot of the wonderful programs that I've seen and that STEM education style of teaching and learning is often in that junior part of the secondary school, and often in the senior, that becomes a little bit different, and that may be more influenced by the governmental policy. More so, though, I think comes down to the particular teacher and how they are going to foster that creative and critical thinking and their own views on creative and critical thinking. So I'm also interested to hear other people's views, like Tash, who's more recently out of secondary school than us, who will be able to share her views on how she found that style of thing. But also it relates really closely to, there was a slide that Deb had about the different pedagogical approaches that teachers may take. And it was on page 11 in Deb's report. And I think that secondary school teachers more so have that tendency to sit more in that disciplinary style, particularly in the senior, where it might be more content driven. So for example, this week and last week, we've been discussing with my pre-service teachers in physics about creative and critical thinking in physics and what that might look like and their own experiences in high school. And many of them reported that, particularly in senior secondary school, it was much more focused on that content and that content style of delivery, preparing for examinations. And whilst as a pre-service teacher now, they really value that creative and critical thinking and that problem solving, and they see a lot of merit there, they also see that tension between some of those assessment pressures that they'll get in senior secondary school. So I think that is a really interesting issue. So I'm interested to see what other people on YouTube think about that. But also, Tash, I'd like to throw to you to ask you about your experience as a student in secondary school, whether you think you had enough time spent on creative and critical thinking.
Yeah, definitely. So I think my schooling experience was a little bit unique compared to some of my peers at university. I went to a rural high school, and I found that, kind of mimicking what you've been saying and what's being said today, there was a really big focus, especially in years 7, 8, and 9, on that skill building and real world example based learning. So at the time, I wasn't aware of it, but we had a STEM program where the goal wasn't to teach us science individually, or to teach us art, or to teach us technology, or any of the different areas. It was to say, hey, here is a problem. Can you guys go and find a solution? And then once we had worked through that project, it was, okay, hey, have you now had a chance to think of your own program and project and your own ideas and to come up with a solution for that? So that was a really great thing that I got to experience as a learner, but it definitely dropped off really, really quickly. And when I hit around year 10, there was a really big shift that I noticed in the teachers that I had been having from year 7 to go from, yeah, let's explore these really cool ideas that you have, to we've got a lot of content that we have to get through so that you can do well. And it was kind of disappointing because I really enjoyed doing the hands-on elements and having the chance to actually do these STEM programs, which I didn't realize at the time, but there was definitely a shift into focusing on just more content rather than skills. So I personally did value the skill building that I got to do. And while the content obviously important, I've definitely used the skills that I learned through the programs that I did in my secondary experience a lot more than referring back to the content that I specifically learned that one class in year 11. So that's been my experience with it.
Thanks, Tash, for your response there. And I'd be interested to hear from Deb maybe a little bit later on, because it sounds to me that that teachers want to keep developing these skills, but perhaps it's things like curriculum and policy that might be standing in their way. So it'd be interesting we'll throw a question on that topic to Deb in a little while. Tash, while we've got you there, I'm going to ask you the next question. So in the report, it mentions the authentic integration model, which has 4 characteristics. And one of these is the application to real world scenarios, which is actually similar to what you were just mentioning. So from your experience in your role at EcoLink, how important do you feel it is to engage students in real world scenarios for deeper learning in STEM education?
I think it's incredibly important. So my role in EcoLink gives me the incredibly unique opportunity to grab a class of students for a day and to give them a chance to use these skills to come up to a solution to a real world problem, because that is what most of our projects and programs are based in. Is here is a problem that our world, our society is facing. Here's some really interesting learning that we can do, and here's a chance for you to have a chance to actually come up with a solution for it. And I find a lot of value in seeing how the students respond to that. One thing to go through university and to be told that this is very valuable, it's a very different thing to then actually be out and doing my job, being part of this career, And to see students come in at the start of the day saying, oh, I'm not really good at science, I'm not really good at this topic, this is not going to be really good, and walking out beaming, super excited, talking about everything that they got to do today. I got to make a solar panel car. That's incredible. What does that actually mean for society? What does that mean for the future? Can that be a really interesting topic of conversation when we look at climate change, when we talk about sustainability and the environment? So these kids, I get to see these kids leave even more excited than they did when they came in. And I think that's really impactful, because if you don't have these students being able to have this authentic experience and to put the content that they've been learning into a very realistic application, it's very easy to forget that what you're learning is actually important and relevant to the real world. Otherwise, kids will just leave being like, oh, I'm never going to use this in real life. And I think that's why it is so important to be able to have that holistic approach and real world examples in STEM education.
Thanks, Tash. And I'm also going to bring Jose into this question because, Jose, in your first answer, you said that it was first Lego League, a competition that got your students really engaged and actually helped to get the teachers on board a bit as well. What do you think the importance is there for real world scenarios or problem solving?
Well, look, I look back on myself as a student, and particularly in secondary school, and I remember learning how to fill out my tax return and thought that was the most useful thing I'd learnt in maths. But I remember this is not a new thing. Like, kids have been saying it forever, haven't they? Like, what's the purpose of this? How is this going to help us? But I suppose we also have to be conscious of, there can still be a fairly self-absorbed, well, how's this going to help me? But it's more about the global citizens that we are developing, of how you can use what you've learnt to make a difference to others, because education is actually a privilege. Working in a Catholic school, it's about having a social conscience and contributing back. So for me, it's like a no-brainer that having students actually develop knowledge, that knowledge is we've only got knowledge for so long. It's more about skills, isn't it? So it's those skills that they can transfer to other scenarios in their life. And I think that these types of projects, I think what those students learn through the first Lego League competitions, and we really nearly got it off the ground here in Geelong, the redevelopment of Point Henry, what those kids had come up with. And that, aside from winning 2 international awards, that didn't really matter so much to me. What mattered to me is if those students could have actually pulled that off here in the city of Greater Geelong, and we could have, got that through, that would have meant more to me than anything. Like, it's just a competition. But what they learned through that, the teamwork, the whole thing of feedback and iteration of a process, and that, nothing's ever going to be straightforward. You're always going to have to improve it, and getting feedback and dealing with disappointment when robots don't work. And, there's so many of those skills that are taught through these, where it's a problem and they've got to come up with a solution. But also, for my kids, a lot of them weren't high academics. These are kids that were not great literate, with literacy for a start. One child I had who was the brains behind the robot where we won the Mechanical Design Award in Australia. Now, this kid we always recognised as a great thinker. So I think there's so many layers to this as to why it's important, and I think it gives some students a real opportunity to shine too, where the confines of our core curriculum can sometimes have the efficacy of those kids so low because they don't achieve. But if we can teach kids to think, we can actually, it's like, I think it's amazing.
Yeah, it certainly does take that focus all about off academic ability completely, and building those skills. Thanks, Jess.
The other thing I wanted to say there is, I think for our high performing kids, academically, I think it's also fantastic for them because often they're lazy thinkers. They're good at doing well, but they're actually not good at thinking well. So I think that STEM can actually stretch them as well.
Yeah, really great point. Thanks for that. Deb, I'm going to throw a question over to you. I mentioned about the policy and curriculum. So, Deb, do you think that the introduction of either a statewide or nationwide STEM education curriculum could help in ensuring that STEM education is taught more widely and more effectively in our schools?
Thanks, Lucas. So curriculum is a very, my short answer will be no. I've got to say, curriculum is a very interesting thing. So I hesitate to say that I don't want to add any more to it. What I do want to see is actually sort of the interweaving of what is already there and focusing on what's important. So there is also a lot of individual ideas that aren't connected. So what STEM does is actually make you think about what are the connections. How do I actually do these multiple things across multiple disciplines at the same time? And often it's a bit of backward mapping from the teachers, because what becomes really important in all of this is the context in which you're situated. So I wouldn't be really advocating for a STEM curriculum, because it sort of devalues the whole thing. It's about real world problems or issues. It's about the connections between the capabilities, the priorities and the disciplines. And so if you start to implement a curriculum, then you've actually undermined the whole need to make those connections and those integrations.
I think there needs to be a lot of work done around teachers as designers.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to name that, sorry, Deb, you go.
And understanding
No, I totally agree, and I suppose it's sort of really, I mean, Joseph, you said before about, you know, you have a shared pedagogy, you've got a STEM statement. It's really actually focusing in on what's important and what you value, and so then making it work, so that you're not really going to change a policy document like a curriculum, nor do you want to add to it. What you do want to do is bring it to life. And so instructional design that brings it to life is fundamentally important.
Excellent, thank you. And we're going to throw the next one over to Jared to start with. So Jared, you work at Monash Education, teaching our initial our teachers in training, I guess. So what approaches are we seeing in initial teacher education at the moment to ensure that graduate teachers come out feeling more confident about integrating STEM education?
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Lucas. And certainly with our pre-service teachers here at Monash, and what's great at the moment is seeing all this chat that's coming through on YouTube about what we can do for STEM education. And a lot of that is around supporting teachers and encouraging them to take risks. And if they fail, that's okay in terms of STEM education. And some of the support that they need, which ties to our previous answer around our previous responses around critical and creative thinking, which I think is really important to think about. Now, in terms of what we're doing at Monash is making some of these links to STEM education quite explicit for our pre-service teachers, both in primary and in secondary methods courses. And so that's addressing some of those questions that Deb has been talking about of what STEM education looks like and what different teachers are doing in their classrooms. And so that real strong link between the theory and the practice. But I also think that whilst we're highlighting these important links and talking about them with our pre-service teachers, considering what that might look like when they go out into the school. So certainly we encourage them to be flexible with the curriculum and be curriculum innovators, which I know ties to what Deb was just talking about. But then I think it also depends on those barriers that they're then faced with when they go out into schools. So whilst we're doing stuff at Monash to push STEM education, I'm interested to know then with our graduate teachers what that looks like for them when they go out to the schools and what they experience when they go out into schools.
Might be a great chance to pass that over to Tash now. So Tash, in your own experiences, how prepared did you feel coming out of initial teacher training to go out and teach an integrated approach to STEM education?
Yeah, it's definitely not where I thought I was going to end up. I thought I was going to be in a classroom teaching to a class of students, the same students every day. And I was definitely nervous, but as I started, I realized that I was much more prepared for a STEM-based career path rather than a science teacher-based career path than I had previously thought. So I was lucky enough to have Jared as one of my science education teachers. And yeah, the way that the classrooms and the way that the science education programs at Monash set me up, it was very clear to me the difference between what STEM education and what science education is, and the value of both, and also how I can be a STEM teacher and how I can use a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach to teaching this content. So when I actually started up my job at EcoLink this year, I found that my learning curve wasn't how do I be a STEM teacher? It was more just this is a new workplace. How do I fit in here? And that really made me feel well prepared. And it also helps me still when I'm creating programs. I'm developing programs based on Indigenous science for EcoLink to be rolled out. And I get to then have an instinctual or better understanding of actually how I can embed this as a STEM program, rather than kind of thinking on my feet being like, oh no, what is a different curriculum? How do I try and make a very holistic program that I can implement? So I feel like it's been a very great and successful implementation of STEM education at Monash.
Yeah, it sounds like a fantastic role you've got there, and without the challenges associated with trying to fit everything into your own curriculum. So thank you for that. It's now time to throw it over to the audience questions, and we have had some questions come through as we go here. So I think we've got Grace ready to ask the first question.
Yes, I am. And I have a question specifically asked to Deb, but others feel welcome to pop their opinions in too. So it's from Ben, and he's asking, how can we as a collective of STEM Ed champions advocate for policy change that creates a viable, effective and well-structured integrated STEM curriculum as a core offering?
Oh, great question. Okay, so I suppose one of the points that I wanted to make was the fact that if we're going to influence policy, we have to certainly make it important. STEM education has to have an important intrinsic value itself. And I think that a lot of the dialogue you hear about the policy is just about STEM, and it's about future workforce and future workers. Whereas I think it's very important as educators that we actually say, no, this is actually important educationally for everybody. And that is something that we can do to shift the arguments. And I suppose it's also saying things like, it's not just about the content knowledge or the concepts, it's very much about the skills, and those skills look different in different discipline settings or different integrated settings. So I would be the first person to say, you know, creativity and critical thinking is everybody's business. Every teacher in the school has an imperative to actually be developing these skills in their students. But it will look different in STEM as it would do in the creative arts, because it's the creative process is a similar thing, but how it actually works in those different ways of thinking and acting is different. So I suppose it's really about a collaborative effort, really honing in on its educational merit rather than its job readiness merit. And I think those sorts of things will hold our students well into the future that they've got in front of them.
Thanks, Deb, for that response. Anyone else on the panel like to contribute there? No? All right, thank you. Very comprehensive answer. Thanks, Deb. Have we got another question from the audience?
Yes, we do, Lucas. We have one from Luhua, which is probably a few people are asking this question as well. There's been quite a lot of discussions online. So they're asking, given we don't have a STEM curriculum, how can we assess students' STEM learning? This is often a question asked by many teachers.
The challenges of assessment in STEM education. I think we'll start, unless someone else wants to take it, can we throw to you again, Deb, on that one?
Oh, okay. All right, so we have to really interrogate our assessment practices. Our assessment practices have to reflect what we value. So I said before that it's not just about academic merit, it's actually about the social and the environmental conditions as well. So our assessment practices will have to be quite diverse. They'll be performance, they'll be formative. We'll have less reliance on text, as we should, if we're really serious about some of the communication that comes out of, you know, problem solving and dealing with projects and issues from a student's perspective. Then in fact, we have to actually be using multiple methods of communication. And so I find it particularly disappointing that, particularly as you move up in senior school and still at university, such a reliance on text. So, you know, I think we need to really be quite innovative in terms of, are our assessment practices enabling us to actually assess for what we really think is important and value, and how do we know that? So I think it has to be a lot more diverse than it currently is.
Thanks, Deb. Anyone else on the panel would like to contribute to that?
Well, I would say it's quite possible, and in fact we do. So when we're making all the links across the curriculum, at the same time we're looking at how that's going to be assessed. So you've got content knowledge, yes, but you've also got you know, scientific inquiry skills. You've got the use of technology. You've got the capabilities. I think it's like any sort of form of assessment. You're just naming what it is. You're designing, you're sort of looking at where are the opportunities to assess and how will I assess that. I think it's just being clear about. So I don't think you're doing assessing STEM learning. You're actually going to be able to assess a whole range of disciplines all at the same time through the one task. And we used to call them rich assessment tasks once upon a time. I don't know where I'm off the mark, but I don't think anything's changed. I think it's quite possible. It's like, how do you assess thinking? Well, it is possible if you know what you're looking for.
Thanks, Jason. Having a primary education background myself, it does give you a great opportunity to think about it as a holistic approach to thinking about how I can bring different curriculum in. I'd be interested to hear from Jared, really, when it comes to assessment as well, because obviously in secondary, there's a whole range of different barriers that you might see in terms of trying to assess this learning. So Jared, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the points that Deb made early on really hit home for me, to the point that I wrote it down in my notebook, which was about, in these situations, really thinking and interrogating what your purpose is for assessment and what you're trying to assess and why you're trying to assess it, which then leads into how you're trying to assess things. And I think a good example of that at the moment in terms of education is, with everything, you know, going remote online learning and such around the world, is people having to rethink about their assessment practices, because traditional modes of assessment perhaps aren't going to work anymore. And so it's asking teachers to really think about that. So I think in that secondary context, again, like Joe said, looking for those curriculum links is going to be really important, but also developing some of those rich assessment tasks. And as Deb said, I think the biggest point there is interrogating your assessment methods and focusing on the what and the why. And then as you're thinking about that, how you're going to assess that knowledge or those skills, about thinking about those multiple methods that you could actually use. And obviously in the senior secondary school, and earlier when we were talking about that with Tash and I, A lot of people were commenting about the influence that VCE has. So I think that'll be different again. But certainly in the junior secondary school, I think there's still that opportunity that exists to focus on assessment in STEM. But it comes back to what Deb was saying as well, and from the report, about what success looks like and what the school values as success in STEM education and how you're going to assess for that.
Thanks, Joe, for that response, and thanks to Jace and Deb as well. Grace, I think we've got another question from the audience.
Yes, I do. And this one's from Kay Triona, who's asking, is STEM/STEM skills represented in core discipline areas or limited to inquiry? Have you noticed integration beyond inquiry?
All right, over to the panel. Deb, Joe, sorry.
What I would say with that, from what I've spoken about with starting with inquiry projects, as starting with inquiry, that was our starting point, but there has definitely been a move to looking, it's actually on my wall at the back here, actually linking it to other core areas, so linking it to English. So how do you actually have a STEM, how do you bring that approach to other areas as well? So core areas. Religious education for us, we see that if you're solving third world problems or, social justice teaching, we see that there are beautiful links there. So it doesn't have to be, from our perspective, just with inquiry learning. It's looking and seeing where the links are. And I think that's about having a really good understanding of the curriculum in the first place. If you've got a good understanding, you'll make the links naturally.
Yeah, we haven't really touched much on pedagogy in terms of this panel discussion. What do you think about this question?
Yes, well, I suppose I think you do make the links. I totally agree with what Joe said. It's about, inquiry is just one approach, and you need a diversity of approaches. So I always get a little bit twitchy about inquiry because it also is very different from scientific inquiry. So I think it's a really good approach, but it's one of many. And I suppose those pedagogies that I was talking about in the report also give you different ways in other than inquiry. So yes, it's a very useful thing, but it's not the only way. And I think it connects with other areas. I think the important thing from a teacher's perspective is, yes, you do have to have a really great knowledge of the curriculum, but even if you don't, there's the backward mapping, so if students are leading problem-based learning or project-based learning, then you can't determine what they're going to learn in advance. So you've got
Deb, I think we're losing you there a little bit with your response. Sorry, I might have to cut you off for that one. So we've got another question.
Backward mapping against the curriculum, and that's an important role for teachers to sort of say, oh,
I think maybe Deb just caught what I was saying there, so we might move on to, I think Deb's internet connection is not going great. We've got another question, I think, for Tash from the audience.
Yes, we do, Lucas.
So thanks, Chantal.
You're right. We do have a question from Brooke online, and this question is for Tash and Jared as well. How or where do you see STEM education integration happening to senior school from such a heavy discipline-specific subject selection towards students' exit score?
That is a big question. I think it is something that has been discussed a lot is policy and curriculum. And I think that is kind of where I think teachers see that there is a barrier. In VC, you have certain tasks that you are required to complete for students to be able to complete Year 12 and get their VC certificate and their ATAR score. And I think this is sometimes why teachers are a little bit scared to do something that maybe pushes outside of just that one curricular area. To myself, I think that the integration of STEM could almost, like STEM could almost be its own subject. There are a lot of students, in even my own experience, having finished high school not very long ago, that kind of enjoyed science or kind of enjoyed engineering or math or technology, but not enough to get what they thought would be a good ATAR score. So they enjoyed the applications of doing math and the skills or the kind of thought processes behind engineering and science. But the idea of sitting in a classroom and focusing 100% onto the content required behind that was very daunting. So if we were able to actually have a project-based or inquiry-based STEM program that was possible to be implemented at a VCE level, that might be a really good introductory way for this STEM education integration in a senior level. That gives us a chance to then, at a future date, if this was successful, to roll that out more in our individual subject areas. That's my own idea and thoughts on it, though. I'd love to hear what Jared thinks.
Thanks, Tash, for that response. And we do see a lot of schools actually having STEM electives maybe in year 9 and 10, but it would be interesting to see in terms of VCE where you could go with that. Jared?
Absolutely. Thanks for your response there, Tash. And it's a question that we do see quite frequently about where STEM education fits in with senior secondary school. And I mean, earlier in this year, I think in March or April, we did our STEM session with our pre-service teachers at Monash, and we had to change the style of it dramatically with COVID and such. And the way we did it was interviewing different people involved with STEM education. And one of them was Professor Amanda Berry, who I know was on the YouTube chat tonight. And one of my questions to her was, how does STEM and VCE work together? And the response was, the short response was, it doesn't. And then we talked a little bit more about that. So I think what you said there, Tash, is really important to think about in terms of the curriculum and the high stakes assessment and the ATAR. And I notice people saying similar things in the YouTube comments at the moment. And certainly, as Lucas pointed out, I've seen STEM subjects in year 9 and 10 as electives. And then certainly as they go on to the senior secondary, it splits up again. So I'm unsure how with VCE that could work at the moment. I think it requires a lot of flexibility. When I was teaching, I taught an electronics unit that was more STEM than disciplinary based, and where we brought in the physics and the maths and the engineering particularly around students making robots and having to use that to solve problems and things like that. But in terms of the VCE structure at the moment, I'm not sure how it would be able to cater for that STEM learning in the way that we've talked about tonight. And I like Tasha's idea there about extending it and making a STEM subject type in the senior school. And that's something I've talked very briefly about with some of the colleagues. And I'm conscious of the time here, but I think as well, as Tasha and I are talking about this, to have Deb's view in particular about what's how STEM education and VCE could link.
Okay, so I know we're short of time, so I'll give a very quick response. So one of the things that I think is trending is that I think I can imagine a day where the ATAR is no longer in existence, and I don't think that's too far down the track. And I say that because I think if you take teacher education as an example at university level, we are actually now not only just selecting on ATAR, we're selecting on capabilities and personal characteristics. And so I think that, and the UMAT and medical field have been doing that for a long time. So I think these skills and capabilities that people have will become more and more sought after, and more as a mechanism for, judging some success. And so I think probably once you remove the policy barrier of the ATAR, you start to think differently about what's possible at VCE or senior secondary. And I know there's some moves towards it already. So you could say the investigation subject at VCE is not very discipline specific. It does have lead to some tendencies around science investigation, but it doesn't have to. I think areas like in the International Baccalaureate, for example, have been doing the similar sort of thing. They have subjects in there that are not discipline specific. And I know also that even just within chemistry and biology, you can actually take a unified subject and still get assessed on both chemistry and biology within the VCE. So there are lots of workarounds starting to emerge that will start to extend this notion of it's actually about your usefulness, the capabilities, developing that, and how you use your knowledge in very productive ways that will start to move forward.
Thank you, Deb, very much for your response there. And I'm going to have to wrap up our panel now, unfortunately. So thank you to Deb for your presentation earlier tonight about your Spotlight report. And you will get, the audience will get a link to that Spotlight report in the next couple of weeks as the recording for this comes out. So thank you, Deb. Thank you, Jose, for your input, and Jared and Tash, we've really appreciated your expert input into this panel discussion. And I'm sure the audience have also would agree with me there.